Good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are joining us today. Welcome to this season finale of the Africa Football Business Show. And as you can see today, we have a full house, a full panel. Thank you very much for those who are joining us today. This show is brought to you by the Football Foundation for Africa. And this particular session, a special session it is, has been organized in collaboration with Sports Africa, which is a network of sports scholars on African sports. Our moderator today will share more on that. To start us off, I would just like to introduce both our moderator for the day as well as the panelists. So I'll be reading out their bios. Very impressive panel we have here, really distinguished guests, and we are really honored. We thank all of them for taking the time to join us today. So for the introductions, I will start with Hikabwa Chipande. Hikabwa Chipande is coordinator of the Africa Union Sports Council. He has a PhD in African history from Michigan State University in the USA, focusing on relationships between football, politics, and social change in Zambia. He has a Master of Science and a Bachelor of Science in Sports from the Norwegian School of Sports Science in Oslo. Chipande has taught sports studies at the University of Zambia in Lusaka and has also worked in several international sports organizations. Welcome, Hikabwa. Thank you very much for joining us today. Second, we have Martha Saavedra. Martha Saavedra is the Associate Director of the Center of African Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where she manages the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program, other center fellowships, and public programs. She received a PhD and a Master of Arts in Political Science at Berkeley and a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from Rhodes College. She has taught at St. Mary's College of California, Ohio University, Escuela de Estudios Universitarios, Real Madrid, and UC Berkeley. In addition to her work on gender, development, and sport, she has also researched agrarian politics and ethnic conflict in Sudan, representations of Africa in Chinese popular culture, and mental health support services at African University. She is a board member of Sports Africa and Soccer Without Borders. Next, we have Chuka Onwumechili. Chuka Onwumechili is Professor of Strategic, Legal, and Management Communications, SLMC at Howard University in Washington, D.C., USA. He has several books, including a textbook on international sport communications, book chapters, and journal articles. One of his books is titled Africa's Elite Football: Structure, Politics, and Everyday Challenges. He currently serves as editor-in-chief of the Howard Journal of Communications. Joining us from Algiers, Algeria, is Maher Mezahi. Maher Mezahi is an independent football journalist based in Algiers. He covers North African football extensively, and his work has been published in the international media, including BBC, The Guardian, The Telegraph, ESPN SC, Al Jazeera English, and The New Frame. He has an active social media presence on Twitter and YouTube, where he presents on football and social issues on the continent. Next, we have James Brown. James Brown is the Vice President of the American Soccer History. Sorry, I'll take that again. James Brown is the Vice President of the Society for American Soccer History and is an experienced global football researcher and consultant, as well as the co-organizer of the 1930 World Cup Conference and events. He orchestrated the 2021 virtual edition of Soccerex Heritage. He currently lives in Paris, France, and is working on 2 books for publication in the near future about football. His grandfather, Jim Brown, played at the 1930 World Cup US national team, Manchester United, Tottenham Hotspur, while his father, George, played professionally in New York with the US national team and Pan American team in the 1950s. They are the only father and son combination inducted into the National Soccer Hall of Fame. Last but not least, our moderator for today, we have Peter Alegi. Peter Alegi is a professor of history at Michigan State University. His books include La Duma, Soccer, Politics and Society in South Africa, which was published at University of KwaZulu-Natal Press in 2004. The other book is African Soccerscapes, one of my favorites, How a Continent Changed the World's Game, Africa's World Cup. Alegi hosts the past, sorry, I'll take that again. Alegi hosts the Africa Past and Present podcast and convenes the Football Scholars Forum. He serves on the executive board of the Africa Sports Network, that's sportsafrica.org, and is series editor at the Michigan State University's Press Africa History and Culture book series. So welcome, lady and gentlemen. At this point, I would like to hand over to Peter Alegi. But just before we do that, also, I take this opportunity to recognize our partners, sponsors who make this possible, and that is OTB Africa, Parma Sports, CBeyond Leadership Forum, and lastly, iSportLand. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian. And on behalf of the Sports Africa Network, we're very pleased to be partnering with the Football Foundation for Africa for this really important online event. And for folks who don't know, Sports Africa is a global network of African sports scholars, although there are some members who are practitioners, including a Paralympic silver medalist, by the way. And we coordinate with also the United States African Studies Association. We have conferences. We've had 14 since 2004, the last 3 based in Africa. We also hold online roundtables and occasional book launches. And basically, we right now are a kind of international platform for academics and practitioners to connect people who are interested in African sports, but also for folks who want to advance their research agendas and have various public outreach objectives. So I am also very honored to have the opportunity to moderate this African football history roundtable. And the extent to which the quantity of scholarship as well as the quality of the research on the African game has progressed in the last few years is really beautifully represented by my colleagues joining us here today. And given the enormity and the diversity of the African continent, I thought it was really important to make sure that we cover different geographical regions. So if you think of kind of quadrants, we have all of the continent's quadrants represented here. We also have the opportunity to spotlight some key nations, such as Nigeria, Algeria, and Zambia, for instance, as well as vital topics and stories that have made, I think, African football one of the most visible, positive, and important aspects of African life, not just at home, but around the world. So without further ado, I'll just let everyone know that each speaker is going to have about 10 minutes. This will be strictly enforced, no Fergie time. And then we will take questions from the audience. So the order we will proceed in is we'll have Hikabwa Chipande, followed by Martha Saavedra, then Chuka Onwumechili, Maher Mezahi, and James Brown. So over to you, Dr. Chipande.
Thank you very much, Professor Alegi. Thank you very much for this invitation. As already mentioned, my name is Hikabwa Chipande, and I am going to share on football and post-colonial, football and post-colonial politics in Zambia. And I'll primarily focus on the period between 1964 to 1991. This is the period which was the period which was the reign of our first Republican president in Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda. So the British South African Company colonized the country, or the area or the region that came to be called Zambia towards the end of the late 1890s. And this led to an influx of Europeans that introduced the game of football to Zambia. And towards the end of the 1920s, there emerged, there was a discovery of copper ore in an area that is now called the Copper Belt region. This is the area that borders the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the discovery of copper ore in this region in the late 1920s led to the emergence of, copper mining towns and urbanization that followed, that created very fertile grounds for the popularization of the game of football in Zambia. So by the time Zambia was gaining independence from Britain on 24th October 1964, football had already become part of the urban popular culture in the country. So around the time when momentum was building for celebrating Zambia's independence in October 1964, a 30,000-seater capacity stadium was quickly constructed in the capital city, Lusaka, for independence celebrations. And if you see on my slide on the left-hand side, I've got a picture of the Independence Stadium just after it was constructed in 1964, which I got from the National Archives of Zambia. So it was also actually common around that time in the 1960s when many African nations were gaining independence to build these big, beautiful stadiums for independence celebrations. And not only for independence celebrations, but for football competitions. And the scholar Peter Alegi argues that actually they also acted as symbols of modernity and national pride in these new nations. So as it was a practice around the time when Zambia gained independence in the 1960s, each country or most countries that gained independence invited fellow independent countries for an independence football celebration. And Zambia invited Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana for an independence football competition, whose final was held in Lusaka, Zambia, in the Independence Stadium that I just mentioned. And unfortunately, in this competition, Zambia was beaten 4-3 by Ghana, who was the then reigning African Cup of Nations champion. So a picture on the left-hand side is the Independence Stadium on the 24th of October 1964 during independence celebrations. There's a gentleman wearing a dark suit, and because he's also slightly dark, so he's not very visible, who is shaking hands with a lady who seems facing him, who was a representative of the queen rather at that time. And the gentleman is Kenneth Kaunda, who was the first Republican president of Zambia. So why did Zambia use Zambia and many other African countries, as I already mentioned, use football for independence celebrations? So Zambia has actually 73 ethnic groups that make up the whole country. And football, with its deep roots in the urban population, made it a kind of rare form of a neutral national culture that most people could identify themselves with and enjoy as a country without seeing any ethnic divisions. So this is the major reason why, football played a central role in Zambia's football celebration. And not only Zambia, as I already mentioned, many other African countries such as Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, and many others used football during their independence celebrations. So Kenneth Kaunda, as I've already mentioned, was the first president of the Republic of Zambia. In the picture on the left-hand side, he's the gentleman wearing a white pair of shorts and folding his arms in a T-shirt that has black and white stripes. And this picture shows of him and his cabinet team, his first cabinet team, after playing a select team of councillors around independence in 1960. So Kenneth Kaunda himself, as we will see, was a very passionate football player, supporter, and referee. Actually, in this case, he was officiating this match between his cabinet and the team of councillors. So Kaunda's government heavily invested in grassroots sports structures, particularly football, building on the welfare schemes that were built during the colonial era. And he also invested heavily in clubs, particularly in urban centers. So Kaunda, after independence and his government, they nationalized major companies to decolonize the economy, as most of it was run by the foreigners, largely the British, who were colonizing Zambia then. So following the nationalization of major companies, he created parastatal corporations. And these parastatal corporations or companies became the major sponsors of sports, particularly football, from grassroots to elite level. In his speech later in 1984, during the third national convention of his party, United National Independence Party, Kaunda pointed out that the party and its government shall continue to encourage sport and recreation, especially among young people, in order to get them off the streets. Parastatals and other working places should endeavor to provide these recreation facilities. And these parastatal corporations, end of quote. So these parastatal corporations that were created after independence were actually overseen by a company or a conglomerate that was called Zambia ZIMCO, Zambia Industrial Mining Corporation, if I'm not mistaken. And President Kaunda himself, he was the board chairperson of ZIMCO. So he was overseeing all these parastatal corporations. So it almost became mandatory for each parastatal corporation to invest in grassroots football or sports development, and which supported all communities around, and also to invest in elite sports clubs. So this was the situation that Kaunda evolved in regarding sports support after independence. However, in the late 1970s, Zambians were starting to become impatient with the fulfillment of independence expectations. As you know, they were very hopeful with self-rule. However, the gap between the rich and the poor continued widening, and ethnic divisions started resurfacing. Opposition political parties started emerging and challenging the ruling United National Independence Party. And above all, there was also increasing external threat to national security from white minority regimes in Rhodesia and South Africa. As most of you might be aware, Zambia around the 1970s, going to the 80s, hosted a number of liberation movements from the region, from South Africa, from Namibia, and many other parts of the region. So Kaunda used these insecurities to actually introduce what was called a one-party state, meaning that they banned opposition political parties. Anyone who was to become president was only to raise through the United National Independence Party, which was the ruling party, and he automatically evolved sort of autocratic tendencies. So the popularity of the game around this time also brought in fears from the government, real or imagined, that is, that probably opponents of the government might actually use the popularity of the game to express dissent amongst the people. However, themselves, who were in government, Kaunda and his United National Independence Party, UNIP, as it was popularly called, the party and its government, used actually the opportunity to use the football to actually promote government's agendas, such as, the ideology of African humanism, consolidating power, authority, and also gaining international visibility and prestige. The national team even got to be nicknamed after Kaunda himself as KK11 or Kenneth Kaunda 11. So, however, whilst, the party and its government under the leadership of President Kaunda consolidated a lot of power with autocratic tendencies, something very interesting happened in the 1970s, particularly starting from 1973 going to 1974. 1975. So the Zambia national team performed very, very well in 1973. The team won almost most of its international competitions. They qualified to the African Cup of Nations that was hosted in Cairo, Egypt, and emerged actually as runners-up to Zaire then, which is currently the Democratic Republic of Congo. And they nearly qualified to the World Cup in West Germany and were again eliminated by their neighbors Zaire, which is today Democratic Republic of Congo. So this kind of, built a lot of enthusiasm and interest amongst a national pride amongst the Zambians. However, towards the end of 1974, going to 1975, the Zambia national team started performing very, very poorly, losing nearly most or all international competitions. And the people, the citizens, the fans started protesting, actually demanding for the disbandment of the national team and also the dismissal or Zambianized dismissal of the Yugoslav coach Ante Buselic, who was coaching the national team then, and actually demanding for the Zambianization of the position of national team, as it was a trend then to demand that all positions that were held by foreign nationals where locals qualified should actually be given to locals. So now that was very interesting. These protests from the individuals actually were gaining momentum, and immediately the Minister of Labor and Social Security, Dingiswayo Banda, stepped up and assured the nation that the government of Kaunda was going to ensure that it takes control and puts back football on its track. So Dingiswayo Banda quickly dismissed the National Football League, which was a structure that was governing elite football competitions, and he also dismissed the Football Association of Zambia that was governing the game in the country, and he replaced them with caretaker structures. So this rapid and drastic response from the government suggests something very important to me. It suggests that football was actually more than sport for the Zambians after independence. It also suggests that the game had political and social ramifications for the new country. It is also actually demonstrating that the government's fear for the government actually was afraid of the potentially unsettling role that soccer fans had after independence, and it also clearly demonstrated the government's determination to control the game in the country. However, the issue of national team coach continued, and the UNIP government's control over the game also continued. In 1980, the new Minister of Sport, who was appointed as Minister of Sport, retired Army General Kingsley Chinkuli, dissolved the existing Football Association of Zambia game. And almost every minister at will could dissolve the Football Association of Zambia, and for actually accusing them for mismanaging the game in the country. And the country struggled to find another successful coach to replace the Yugoslav coach Ante Buselic, who was fired. They recruited a number of local coaches but did not do a good job. A few foreign coaches did not do a good job. They even hired the Polish coach Wisław Grabowski, whom they fired actually within a very short period and accused him of being an attention seeker and not respecting them. So this issue of Zambianizing and giving the position of the national team coach to a local took a very long time and was very complicated. A lot of consultations had to be made, going as far as the Prime Minister and the President himself, demonstrating how actually political leadership was involved in the running of football in the country. So by 1964, this is when now the country settled for a retired colonel or a retired army officer, Brighto Banda, as national team coach. Also showing how the political system was involved in the running of football and the role that the game was playing in the country. So Kaunda's government really feared that if the national team underperformed, the citizens would raise against the government. And despite government having authoritarian tendencies, as I have already mentioned, Authorities feared the volatile reaction from large numbers of citizens over the mishandling of the game, a rare demonstration, in my view, of power from below, fearing the people, the ordinary fans from below. So as I wind up, I know that my 10 minutes is almost up. So Kaunda was not the only, actually, African president who used football for his political gains. Other political African leaders, such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Felix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast, Joseph Mobutu in the neighboring Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, and many others, all of them actually used football to bolster their political power and popularity. However, to date, no Zambian president has invested as much as Kaunda did in terms of grassroots football development and club development across the country. It is for this reason that a sociologist and sports writer David Goldblatt called Kaunda a rarity, you know, an African leader who did not only support football, but also loved it. In the interest of time, I end here, and thank you very much for this invitation and for this great opportunity. Thank you, and over to you, Professor Alegi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hikabwa Chipande. And if you're interested, anyone out there, in reading more about this story, there are several academic articles that Hikabwa has published. So please look into that or contact him directly, perhaps for an electronic copy. But now we switch over to the women's game on the African continent. Another story that is a rarity in terms of its coverage, regrettably, but a story that has a long and interesting history that predates some of the more contemporary transformations. And to tell some of those stories and to track this trajectory, there is nobody better out there than Dr. Martha Saavedra. Over to you.
Okay, great. And I don't know, do I need to do something to put my slides up there, or do they pop up? Ah, there we go. Great. All right, so I'm going to give an overview snapshot, and I will say Zambia has, on the women's side, has recently come forward, and they were in the Olympics and all that, so we can continue with that a bit. So recently, middle of November, there was the inaugural African Confederation's Women's Champions League that took place in Egypt. The 8 best clubs from the zonal unions around the continent came together, and the Mamelodi Sundown ladies, they won. They beat Ghana's Hasaka's ladies. Third place went to Morocco's Asfar, and they did that by beating Equatorial Guinea's Malabo Kings. And so this is a new event that emerged this year, and it is part of CAF's women's football strategy. So I remember years ago when I was working on women's football, I had found an email, wrote to them and said, where's your information on women? And they basically wrote back and said, we don't have anything, So now at least you can go and you can download this women's football strategy. And in it, they make lots of interesting plans and promises. They have, development competitions, marketing and promotion, professionalization, leadership, social impact, and all of these different things that I clipped out of there. Everything from engaging with schools to having leadership workshops to media strategies, and so they're engaging, and you can see that after the Champions League took place, we still see even just this week. They're using what came out of that as on Twitter and getting people to engage through voting for their favorite players and trying to whip up some interest in this and capture the interest that is out there and giving people a place to go to, trying to create the name. So CAF is engaging now, perhaps more than they ever have, with women's football across the continent. And I just want to say that if you want to go and you can watch the highlights being broadcasted, and you can go and look and see the highlights from the Champions League. We also have a women's football organizing committee. As you know, the General Secretary of FIFA is an African woman, Fatuma Samara, but then within CAF, also Isha Johansson, she also serves on the FIFA committee. So there is more organizational attention with inside FIFA at this point. I mean, CAF at this point, and FIFA maybe too. But I wanted to give a quick overview here of who was playing where, and what it looks like across the continent. So here's where the statistics come in. Now, I know that there's a lot of critique of the FIFA rankings. These are the Coca-Cola sponsored FIFA rankings. They have formulas. You can go in there and look and how they derive these formulas. What I did just to get a sense of not that having a national team is the be all for women's football in a country, but it is somewhat of a representation of organization and the ability to make things happen. So what I did here was just to take the rankings, the FIFA rankings for the third quarter, which was roughly either August, September, in some cases October when they came out, and then just counted the numbers of African teams that were ranked. And you can see some interesting issues here, that back in 2007, there were 32 teams ranked. These rankings started in 2003 for women in general. That's at least as far back as they go on the website. Maybe they go back farther somewhere else. But there was a steady increase from 2003 to 2007. The stars at the bottom of the slide show when there was a FIFA Women's World Cup that took place. But then after 2007, you can see it dropped off tremendously, and it has only recently in 2020 got back up to 32 teams, now 33 teams in the most recent rankings. And so I can guess at all the different reasons why we had the dropping off of rankings. What we see so often is that a team will get out there, they'll get some effort underway, some organization behind them, some money behind them. But then if you look at a lot of the tournaments and things like that, there will be lots of withdrawals and all sorts of reasons why teams then don't compete. I also looked at the frequency of appearance in these third quarter things. And for all 19 years that they had these rankings, Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria, Morocco, and South Africa were the only teams that appeared in every single one of these. And then I'm not going to read through these, but if you want to find your favorite country, you can see how many times they appeared in here. And I will say that at the, two teams appeared only twice, Benin and Gambia, and a couple teams only appeared once, Eritrea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, and Zanzibar. Zanzibar is not a country. We can appreciate that they were making an effort. I will point out that Eritrea, it was very, very early on, maybe in 2006, and then they've disappeared and they haven't competed since then. So these are countries that have never, ever appeared in the FIFA ranking. So again, I'm not going to read them out, but you can see that there's a range of countries from different parts of the continent that never appear in the ranking. That said, many of those teams that never appear in the FIFA rankings, in fact, if you go to the RSSF archive, which may or may not be the be-all for representing competition, but it is a good place to get a quick overview of what's happening around the continent and around anywhere in the world. And God bless the people that pull together these statistics. I was able to find that at least when I looked at the 2020-2021 club season, that for most of them, there was some kind of league competition. If not this year, maybe in the last 2 years. And of course, COVID affected a lot of things. The only place that I have not found competition, organized competition, was in Somalia. And that includes Somaliland, Puntland. So Somalia, we can understand maybe why it's not happening there. I do know that there are women interested in football in Somalia, but so far there hasn't seemed to have been a league. I am very happy to say that Sudan has a league now, and they're working at it, and there's some really interesting things happening there. I have worked in Sudan before, so for me, that's really important. One of the questions, and I don't really have all the answers to this, but some guesses, and here on the right side, what I put in there is the average ranking for these teams right here that have had many appearances. And if somebody wants to look at all the statistics I put together, I'm happy to send you this massive spreadsheet that I've put together, which probably has mistakes in it. But Nigeria, of course, is at the top, and they've always appeared. They're always ranked #1. You know, Ghana, South Africa, Cameroon, Morocco, they kind of go back and forth in terms of the rankings that they have. Some like Zambia. Zambia is the one that's come up the most recently. Some Ethiopia was in there quite a bit for a while and has dropped off a bit. But why? What leads to this? And I think these are things that we can actually probably need to do more research on. That is population size, Nigeria obviously having a large population, the investment, the number of leagues, active leagues at the club level. So Nigeria has at least 3 levels, and professional too. People are paid. South Africa's league is trying to become professional now. And then you can also look at overseas opportunities and how many of the players get that international experience. I want to point out that the Total Energies Africa Cup of Nations is coming up in Morocco in 2022. More teams than ever, 44, went into the first round, although some of them, including Rwanda and DRC, withdrew. Rwanda, it was interesting. From high on top, the government said, hey, we don't have enough going on here. We're just going to withdraw and not do this. We also had in Sudan, they had to call off the second round. Algeria went to play in October and got caught in the coup. So the Algerian team spent a week at a hotel waiting for the coup to settle down. So, we see that a lot of teams at least entered. I also want to point out that at the grassroots, there's a lot going on. I personally, in full disclosure, I work with Soccer Without Borders. They do a lot on the Global 5 Accelerator, Goal 5 Accelerator. So the SDG Goal 5, they're working with teams all around East Africa. Moving the Goalposts, another favorite one in Kalifi, they're doing a lot of work. And at this, I'm going to conclude, though, just to say that we definitely need more work. Beth Packer, Mary Ang, and others have been doing some really interesting research. We need to look at the competitions, the leagues, the teams, the players, the officials. I have an interest in referees and looking at, how their professional careers go. There's a whole bunch of films. Everybody seems to have a film about a women's club in some place and how they struggle, and they're fascinating, although I think it's a genre in and of itself. And it would be great to have some media folks look at all those documentaries that come out. And then we also need to look at the factors that support more access, training, and opportunities. So there's the research there. And I would also say we need to also do advocacy. And that's where I'm going to leave it. More advocacy on women's football in Africa. All right. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Martha. Nigeria, of course, is a powerhouse in women's football. So I'm going to pass the ball over to our specialist on Nigeria, Dr. Chuka Onwumechili. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Before the slides goes up, essentially I'm going to talk about domestic football league in Nigeria, but also talk about, from time to time during my presentation, talk about Africa in general, as I wait for the slide to get uploaded there. If not, I could just go ahead and begin. Essentially, one of the things that I wanted to really talk about is for us to pay attention to a quote that really represents a dream. It says, "It has little to do with the number on my shirt or the roar of the crowd, but everything to do with the dream in my heart and the desire to play." I think this represents the way soccer is viewed in Africa. Soccer is really a man's game and a woman's game, something that they love to do. It's not simply because money is paid for it, it's a love. Okay. So when I talk about Africa, I hope that you would capture this feeling of love for the game. because that's where I come from in terms of talking about it. The key issues that I wanted to talk about today is one, to talk about transnational broadcasting and fandom on the continent, then talk about the football academies, then talk about culture of religion and magic, and then the issue about migration and those that are left behind. And as I talk about these things, you would learn, I'm hoping you will get a clear view of the game in Africa in general. But most of the time, I'm going to focus with Nigerian examples. So I start off by talking about transnational broadcasting and fandom. One of the things we find that has really changed football in Africa is the broadcasting of the game. Initially, when the state controlled broadcasting in most parts of the continent, there was a large fan followership in each of the countries. Today, that followership, at least in terms of attending games live, has dropped. And the reason for this drop is because the government surrendered control of broadcasting to private ownership. Private ownership in then seeking an easier way, cheaper way to broadcast games, decided to broadcast European games. And the fans lost interest. And you begin to see this in several parts of the continent. In Nigeria, it's a major issue. In Nigeria, for example, the only cities where you're going to see large attendance to games remain in the northern city of Kano. In the rest of the country, very few people attend local games. And that's simply because of this change in making broadcasting private. So that's a major change that has taken place. The other thing also that has taken place is that over time, rivalry, that is, the rivalries have declined as well. These rivalries are linked to this broadcasting of games that come from Europe. What it then meant is that the key rivalries that had existed, like in Nigeria, there used to be a rivalry between a team in a battle that was called the Shooting Stars and the Enugu Rangers in the East. I was surprised when I went to Enugu a few years ago, talking to people in the city of Enugu, and they couldn't even name the players of Enugu Rangers, which is a major team of the city of Enugu. But they could tell you what a Liverpool player had done the night before. And that's the problem now that is existing for the game in Africa. And that's something that I want you to pay close attention to as we talk about these issues. The other issue that I pointed out is the rise of football academies. Essentially, with the focus being in Europe, Africa has become the farm for producing the talents, and then those talents are developed overseas. So essentially, the things that are now becoming big in Africa is the growing of academies, and all of them are all kinds of academies. Some, I went to Weekend Academy that was managed by the late Paul Hamilton, who at one time coached the Nigerian national team. His academy was barely a room that housed the entire academy at the National Stadium, but it was still an academy because there is no control of what serves as an academy and what doesn't serve as an academy. That's the situation today. Now, most of the kids, the young men and young women that are in Nigeria are going through this academy. Even the adult who basically at the age of playing for major clubs in Nigeria wouldn't do so, because if you play for a club in Nigeria and you go to Europe, that means you have to try out for the major team and you may not be able to make it. So most of them would rather, in spite of their age, some of them are already past the academy age, would stay in the academy. Because when you get to Europe, you will then be considered of the academy age, and have a better opportunity to make the team in the long run. So that's some of the things that are happening now. And so the academies become the dominant gateway. And the elite leagues are dying out. And in some countries in Africa, you actually see that some of these academies have entered the elite leagues, as you see in Senegal and in some other countries as well. Beyond the academies, the book also talks about the culture of religion. And we do know that Hikabwa, who's here today presenting, he actually had a chapter on this issue about the culture of religion and magic. I'm going to mention this as one of the misconceptions that exist in Africa is when people use what in quotes is called magic. That's actually traditional religion. And even though people downplay its use, the question becomes, why would you downplay it and then not downplay Christian religion that is used in the same game? They are one and the same. It's simply a matter of praying for some transcendental force to be able to help you to win a game. Okay, but in this book, it goes in depth in talking about religion and magic in the African game. I think there are about 2 or 3 chapters that focus on various aspects of this that appear in the book. But I think the key takeaway that I want you to go with is to understand that this is simply a religion. And the same way you have the Christian religious belief, that's the same way you got to consider the African traditional religious belief as well. Okay. Peter, this is making me race in terms of the time because I have my clock out here and the time is racing rather rapidly. The other part that I really want to focus my attention on is migration and those left behind, because I've done more recently some research work in this area. One of the things we are finding, as you know, as these footballers leave the continent or they leave Nigeria to go overseas, that is also changing the culture at home. You are now finding women that are becoming the head of household in Nigeria, and that is creating some conflict within the household. So my recent research deals with these kinds of conflicts that exist in families. We did talk to some women about this, that is the left at home wives, about the situation that they're going through. But this is a phenomenon that is coming up where we are essentially now having women heading households where the footballers have left home. And when I talk about leaving home, I'm not simply talking about leaving home for overseas, but even within Nigeria, because of the distances, when footballers move from place to place, they often have to leave their families at a particular residence while they move from season to season, joining different football clubs. So that is a phenomenon that is beginning to exist in terms of these women that are having to basically manage the family. And it's not simply the nuclear family that we are talking about here, because footballers, because they are wage earners, they also support an extended family. So you find these women that are now heading not just the nuclear family, but the extended family as well. So that's what we are finding. And the other phenomenon that's also happening is that in Nigeria, for example, if you're playing internally in Nigeria, the salaries or the wages don't often come. There may be months and months where you're owed wages. So what then happens? What happens is that these women now have to find their own work in order to be able to sustain their families. So that's the situation that's happening in Nigeria. Then I just go to the very last slide that I want to share. This slide basically, even though it's not showing up there, I want to point out that there are several things that happened after the book was written. One of them, Martha just mentioned, which is the new African Women Championship that came about. Then there is a proposed African League that hasn't been approved yet, but it's certainly an issue of discussion, a big discussion among people who love football all over Africa. That's an issue that's controversial, that people will have to pay attention to. Then the other one is also the idea of a new global calendar and the funding, the estimation of funding. How does that help, or how does that hold back African football? That's an issue that is also of importance going forward. I would like to stop at this point, and I hope that I made the time.
Great, thank you, Chuka. You covered lots of important topics. And, West Africa has been arguably the leading region in African football, alongside, of course, North Africa. And representing that crucial region, and one of the powerhouses also within that region, Algeria, such a critical player in African football today and in the past, is Maher Mezahi. So I will turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Peter. I'm really, really excited to have been featured on this panel amongst such esteemed colleagues. I've learned so much already just listening over the past 30 minutes. I'll be talking about the FLN team, which is for me one of the most remarkable stories in world football, really. And it's really the story of the Algerian national team, which actually predates the country's independence. So as many of you might know, Algeria won its independence from France in 1962. But the Algerian national team actually predates independence. The first iteration of the Algerian national team was created in 1958 by the FLN. The FLN was the entity that was fighting for Algerian independence against French colonization. So the idea came from one man. His name is Mohamed Boumezrag, who was an FLN militant and who was actually a player coach. He had played in France before. This is actually the last photo that I wanted to show. If we can go to, is there a way I can scroll? No. Yes. One more. The next one before that. Right. Okay. So Mohamed Boumezrag's idea was to, at the time, there were plenty of fantastic Algerian players. Some of them were playing in Algeria. The really good ones would go play for the major clubs in France. So you had Algerian players playing at the 1954 World Cup. Some of them had played in the Olympics before. Many of them had been capped internationally for France. Around 1958, so this was 4 years into the Algerian War of Independence, the FLN decided they wanted to export the war. They didn't just want to fight the French on the battlefield. They also wanted to make it a cultural war in a sense. And one of the ways they wanted to do this was through sport. And so they decided to create this Algerian national team. And the way they did it was that they asked 13 players who were playing their football in France. They were playing for clubs like Monaco. They were playing for clubs like Nice, Saint-Etienne, Lyon, Avignon, many different top Division I clubs. And they asked them all to leave their clubs on the same day, on April 13th, 1958. So this was 2 months before the Sweden World Cup of 1958, the famous World Cup where Pele, as an 18-year-old, took the world by storm. And on one night, they all decided to leave and to meet in Tunisia. Two of these players were probably destined to be to represent the French national team at the 1958 World Cup. Mustafa Zitouni and Rachid Makhloufi. These were probably the two best players. They had already been capped for France. Makhloufi hadn't been capped for France yet, but he had played for the military team, and he had a fantastic year. He was still a young player, and he was supposed to go to that World Cup. So it was a big blow. As you can see, these are the newspapers. Everybody knows the famous French sports broadsheet newspaper, L'Equipe, one of the most famous in the world. And this was the headline the next day. 13 Algerian footballers disappear. And you can see the names: Zitouni, Boubacar, Bentifur, Bouchouk, Brahimi, etc. And what they ended up doing was they left France. They had to leave really in the middle of the night. There were a few different pathways, and they met up in Tunisia, passing through Italy, Switzerland, taking the boats, some flying. And they met in Tunisia. If I could show the next photo. And the next day, they had a press conference. And you have Mustafa Zitouni, who had been capped for France 5 times on the left. After him, you have Khadour Bakhloufi, who played for Monaco. In the middle, you have Abdelaziz Bentifur, who played for France in the 1954 World Cup. On his right, the tallest man in the photo, you have Abdelrahman Boubacar, the goalkeeper. And on the very right, I believe that is Ammar Rouai, I believe, who was playing in the south of France. I can't remember for which club yet, but they were all playing for Division 1 clubs. And so for the next 4 years, the mission of this FLN team, of this first iteration of the Algerian national team, was to tour the world, raising awareness for Algerian independence. Because I spoke to many of these players now, there's still a handful of them around, and they said that at the time in the 1950s, people didn't really understand what was going on in Algeria. They didn't know basically where Algeria was. For many, Algeria was just another department of France. They didn't know that there was a struggle going on, a war of independence that was raging, and they wanted to really shake the world out of its indifference. And so one of the ways to do that, of course, was sport. As you can imagine, the French Football Federation was not happy with this. They were not happy at all. They actually wrote to FIFA, and I saw a letter from FIFA that's in the FLN Museum in Algiers, where FIFA threatened anybody that was to play against this FLN team that they would exclude their federation or there would be sanctions. And that actually did happen. So most of the clubs they ended up playing were either from the Arab world or from the Eastern European bloc, or maybe some even in Southeast Asia, China, Vietnam, etc. So the first matches they played were Tunisia, Libya, Morocco. Morocco, because they had played with their A team, were suspended by FIFA for 1 year. Egypt saw that Morocco had been suspended. They got cold feet. They didn't want to play against this FLN team because they saw that Morocco had been suspended, and Egypt were in a precarious situation at the time. CAF was just being established. The headquarters were supposed to be in Egypt. They really wanted to keep that. And so they said, we'll give you guys money for your cause, but I don't know if we can play you with our top team. And so as a result, this FLN team ended up playing a lot of different clubs or trade unions. They played memorable matches in Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, I believe Czechoslovakia at the time as well. They ended up playing, I think, more than 90 matches and having 60 victories. So they were very, very good. And it was really an integral part of the Algerian War of Independence, because parallel to the military side of the war, we also had a sporting diplomacy side of the war as well. Quite infamously, Algeria's first president of the provisional government, Ferhat Abbas, was one of the big revolutionaries in Algerian history, said that the FLN team advanced the Algerian cause by 10 years, speaking to the power of this cultural diplomacy. So overall, more than 30 players ended up representing this FLN team because they came in waves. The initial wave in 1958 was 13 players, but then a year later, 2 years later, and there was another wave of 10 players, and another 2 years later, there was another wave of 10 players, and they ended up being a brotherhood of players that ended up having very strong bonds even post-independence, and they eventually ended up being really the pioneers of the game in Algeria, in a sense. In independent Algeria. Rashid Makhloufi, who we mentioned before, ended up coaching the Algerian national team. He won the 1975 Mediterranean Games with the Algerian national team. Abdelhamid Zouba, who was a defender for the FLN team, I believe still holds the record. He coached the Algerian national team 6 times, and 80-90% of these players actually ended up going on to be coaches or some kind of technical advisors at the federation. And really, one thing that really marked me, because this is a story that I really hold dear to my heart, but I remember in 2000, I believe it was 2014, when the great Eusebio passed away. And this just maybe highlights their sacrifice a little bit. Eusebio, funnily enough, coincidentally enough, he passed away on the same day as Mustafa Zitouni of the FLN team. And Eusebio, no fault of his own. I'm not trying to cast any aspersions. That's the last thing I'm trying to do. But Eusebio was, as we all know, born in Mozambique, and he was ethnically Mozambican, and he ended up representing Portugal, and he was celebrated. He got to play in the World Cup in 1966, and he became a world superstar. And on the day that he passed away, they had filled up Benfica Stadium, Estadio de Luz, and there was a grand procession, and people were throwing scarves on the pitch. And I remember it was such a beautiful moment that rightfully celebrated such an influential and great player. And it was just funny to me that they died on the same day, because Mustafa Zitouni passed away in Nice, France. I believe there was 13 people at his funeral, and it was really anonymous. And for me, it really, in a sense, it really highlighted that the sacrifice that some of these players made, because Zitouni at the time was one of the best defenders in world football. He was starting for the French national team over Robert Jonquet, who was one of the great defenders of the Stade Reims side of the late 1950s that was pushing Real Madrid in the Champions League finals. Actually, Robert Jonquet, who ended up regaining his place after Zitouni defected with the French national team, he actually broke his leg in the semifinal against Brazil. And at the time, there were no substitutions in 1958, so he had to sort of limp around for the rest of the match. So who knows? Maybe if Zitouni had played, maybe France would have beaten that Brazil side. It's really like touch and go. And if France does win that first World Cup in 1958, maybe he becomes a superstar. But in the end, he didn't. He gave up that kind of lifestyle, that career for his country. And for me, even though he ended up dying in relative anonymity, I think that really amplifies that sacrifice, at least for a lot of Algerians. And finally, if we can go to the last slide, that's Rachid Makhloufi. And for me, this is just a great way to end the story, because Rachid Makhloufi, as mentioned, was supposed to be part of the 1958 squad. He was young enough. He had left for the FLN team in his early 20s, and he stayed with the FLN team 1958, 59, 60, 61, 62, and he was young enough to actually go back to a playing career at Saint-Etienne, the great Saint-Etienne sides of the 1960s. So it was funny because in 1963, he didn't know how he would be welcomed or how he would be received by the French public after having publicly defected, leaving his club, went and supported, the Algerian independence movement. And he said that initially everything was tense when he talks about his first game back at the famous Stade Geoffroy Guichard in Saint-Etienne. And he didn't really know how people would, and he heard one comment that was kind of negative. But he said as soon as he got the ball at his feet and he just did a quick move and a nutmeg, the crowd just exploded into cheers, and really sport ended up winning. And this picture that we have here, I believe, is of the 1970 Coupe de France, the French Cup, that he ended up winning. And again, ironically enough, was handed this trophy by, I believe Charles de Gaulle was there handing him this trophy. So if that isn't symbolism, I don't know what is. So yeah, I think my time is up now. So thank you. I just, again, a story that I really hold dear to my heart, that I love, and I'm just happy to share it with all of you. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Maher. This is really an extraordinary story. And Makhloufi was the head coach, I believe, when Algeria defeated West Germany 2-1 in 1982, right? And I should also point out that this is a great story about the empire striking back in a way, but there was a cost. Makhloufi was never called back to the French national team. So, again, that difference between club and country is quite important here. So thank you. And we will now close our roundtable with our final presentation. James Brown, the Vice President of the United States-based Society of American Soccer History, who's been devoting himself to the reconstruction of the 1930 World Cup experience from multiple perspectives, and has learned a lot in the process of doing that research. Lessons that I think are very useful also for people interested in African football history. So over to you, James.
Thank you so much, Peter. I appreciate it. Thank you, Brian, for inviting me to this session. And I'm pleased to be with everybody, such great panelists. This journey and the passion that everybody has for this beautiful game is outstanding. And once it's in you, it never leaves you, and it's always around you. And it's even more powerful when you happen to be connected to a part of this history. And when you talk about the United States and world competitions, FIFA, World Cup, everybody just laughs, because today we're just quite average, and we hope to get better and better and better. But back in the day, in the 20s and the 30s, the US was strong. They were strong in a sense that they never backed down from the opportunity to go against the best. Sometimes they got completely destroyed against the best, especially in the Olympics in the 1920s. But then when we come up to the 1930 World Cup, there was a big difference between how the US team was able to compete against the others, because we were all professionals at that moment, and we didn't have to deal with this amateur issue. So these were very important. And when you were looking back at history and seeing how the U.S. Was competing and how they got third place in that World Cup because of these UK born, UK born but US raised players. That made me want to go and find more. We had a very rich history in the 1920s. So part of my work was saying, I've heard all of these great stories, from generation to generation. And that's what links us with this great African story, is that fortunately and unfortunately, all these stories come down through the generations, from father to son, from mother to daughter to cousin to everybody. But in terms of the documenting and the preservation, and then the education for others, that's my role as vice president with SASH, is to go out there and help to fill in these pieces, and also to educate people and say, hey, you know what? We're not too bad. We weren't too bad. So I decided, after hearing all these stories from my grandfather, who was a striker with the U.S. national team, and also a pro with the New York Giants in the late 1920s, and then played for the U.S. national team. Then went to Manchester United and Tottenham Hotspur, Brentford as well. He did that in the 30s before World War II. And I said, I need to know more about this, because I was a bit embarrassed, because I never read a match report, an actual game that was in these newspapers. So one great thing is that we're able to access strong newspaper archives in the US and in the UK. And this is what I'm hoping will gradually happen with the cooperation and support of CAF in Africa. So because of the work that I decided to do, I said, I'm going to go and find as many people, as many relatives as I could about that 1930 team. So there were 16 players and and 4 staff. So I was able to go through and use all of my digital resources and cooperations with groups in France, Belgium, South America, in order to get as much as possible. So it was kind of a joint project that allowed me to not only trace my own family history, but also go and get these players and then collect these digital and physical memorabilia from families. That's really important, because they all heard these stories as well, but sometimes they didn't even really know that there was a box in their basement, in their attic, maybe it was on a shelf in a closet, that had this great history. So that's what I'm starting to do, is writing books. I'm writing a first book that will come out in August. And this is about our family career. These are all relatives of my family, and it was a mix of 2 football codes, rugby and football. So with their cooperation and my research, we're slowly getting into it. And now I was able to fill out that list of careers for not only for my dad, but for my grandfather. There were a few teams in the beginning that I did not know. And I was really, really happy to find these teams and be able to fill out that information for the Hall of Fame, for US Soccer. And I love the idea that CAF is supporting, really helping teams and nations understand your presence is really necessary, whether it's social media, having a website, and slowly gathering all of that information so that people can go and find that repository in order to learn more. You know, and it's probably within the past 10 years that work has been really emphasized, and I really applaud CAF and everybody else that's out there really trying to get the information out. So when we talk about this family network that I've created, my main sources of inspiration were these genealogy sites. You know, the British Newspaper Archive is fantastic. Family Search, Ancestry.com, Spoke as well. And unfortunately, but kind of great, is Find a Grave. You know, because in Find a Grave, normally you have the picture of the person, you have a picture of the gravestone, but also the obituary. And that talks and that lists the people in the family, the people who were maybe there, but also their surviving relatives. So those are great leads. And social media is even better. Twitter, Facebook, being able to find these descendants. So, you know, being able to find 4 players from that 1930 World Cup team, as well as some opponents, was great. And then you can't be more humbled when you're able to discuss with people at Manchester United, Tottenham Hotspur, Manchester City, even Guildford. You know, Guildford City is a non-league team, and it was a non-league team back in the 1930s when my grandfather played with them. But they were essential in getting that information and really pulling everything and intertwining everything so that we were on the same wavelength. So over the past 6 years, I've been able to collect over 1,000 images from the 1930 World Cup and documents as well. So I work with the Hall of Fame to make sure that they're up to date, you know, because they have a new Hall of Fame in Dallas, Texas. It was originally in Oneonta, New York, where my father was a board of director and interim president, and my mother was the archive manager. You know, they did that in their past, you know, in their retirement. So that's really fantastic to be able to use your free time to advance the cause of this beautiful game. And I applaud all of the speakers who were able to do that, you know, and that's what they're doing. So here is just kind of a quick list, well, a visual list of these members, these family members, based on that team photo from Brazil. And I'm really, really happy to say that because of some archived information that I received this week, I've actually been able to add a 12th member, and that's Mike Bookie, who was a player. He didn't play in the games in the World Cup games, but he played in the post-exhibition games. So I'm having a wonderful time talking with his relative, you know. So the idea is to help put all of these people in contact with each other, and as well understand where everybody's located, so that when we come up to 2026, which is really crucial for the US, Canada, and Mexico, to say, okay, New England region, you know, we got Pat Nod, Billy Gonzalez, you know, those things are really important for, you know, to be able to put these journalists, whether they're domestic or international, in touch with these families. So one great collaboration is that one of the programs that Leicester City put together was of Alex Wood. I was contacted through Twitter and said, hey, these guys are looking to do a story on the US team, but we really don't have a lot of information. Can you help us out? And I said, hey, no problem. I was already in touch with the Wood family, Alex's family on the West Coast, and they were able to collaborate with John Hutchinson with Leicester, and they put an absolutely fantastic spread together. You know, I love being able to help put people together to advance this great game, you know. So my personal efforts, you know, I love the 1930 World Cup, and I don't speak a lick of Spanish. I can kind of read it about 50%, but I'm working with some really great people: Esteban Beckerman from Argentina, Aldo Mazzucchelli from Montevideo. These guys are some of the most passionate historians, authors, and just great men, you know. So my hope is to get down there and do a documentary, do some more research down in Montevideo when the time is right. And you're satisfied when you come up with these gems. You know, this picture here is the flag presentation of the first match on July 13th, US versus Belgium. And one thing that was very, very interesting is that I was able to acquire home footage of the US coming through the crowd, holding that flag, and I see my grandfather passing right through, right in front of the camera. So that's one of the great advantages of being able to do this research and connect with people. And I really hope that that what's going to happen in Africa from a historical point of view is that with Brian, with all of his work and efforts, is connecting with all of these nations and making sure that they understand that history, knowing your history, allows you to move better into the future. So thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to any questions.
Excellent. Thank you for that presentation, James. And the first question is actually for you.
Nice.
Simona Gindes asks online, how much will the research project eventually cost, and how long will this project last?
Well, I'm working with a number of people, a number of associates throughout Europe and South America. And if we want to really do this right and in a proper fashion, we're hoping to do galas, historical spotlights on personalities from the 1930 World Cup, 1924 Olympics, 28, and as well run conferences, whether it be a hybrid of virtual and physical. And we're probably looking at about 150 to 250,000 dollars per year, going up to 2030, and then whatever we can do beyond. But of course, you got to find those deep pockets, you know. So that's always one of the greatest things that we need to, you know, one of those stumbling blocks we need to get over. So that's around the cost. If you really want to do something really spectacular.
Brian, I see you've got your mic on. Do you want to ask a question or comment?
No, there's a question from the audience, from Lucas Souza. Western North African sports have asserted their dominance in football history as the continent's football powerhouses. Do you see equal potential in East Southern Africa's football development? Maybe you can get comments from Chuka and from Hikabwa to represent the two regions.
Okay. Let me go from in terms of people who had written in the book. I think that all areas actually have potential, including East Africa. And we do know that even in some previous Nations Cup, African Nations Cup, East African countries, even though they may not have won the championship as much as, say, West African or North African countries, but they have shown a lot of potential. And it's just a matter of opportunities. For example, one of the things is finding pathways to be able to get to playing in the European leagues. That's one of the things that can also help to develop the game down there, I believe, because I think the players are just as well as talented as players from other regions. That would be my take on this.
Yes, and if I may just echo what Professor Onwumechili pointed out, it also applies to Southern Africa. A lot of good players across the region and very impactful players. But of course, the challenge is the networks, support systems, and pathways to competitive clubs. That is where they really struggle. South Africa has produced a number of noticeable players, and so basically it is pathways, and that is central, I think, in terms of exposing the players to competitive leagues and being visible. Yes.
And of course, implicit in that question was that we were talking about the men's game, because in the women's game, I think Southern Africa is most definitely up there with West Africa. And I should also point out that there are divisions within regions, right? We say West Africa, but we're dealing with a region that has 1,500 languages, right? So we have to also be careful when generalizing. If I could just step in for a moment, thinking about your wonderful presentations, I thought there were some common threads that might be worth kind of teasing out a little bit, and I'm trying to figure out how to show my my slide here. For some reason, it doesn't seem to be. Oh, there it is. Wonderful. The magic of the internet. So listening to you all, I think it's amazing how much you've gotten out of the internet, given that the internet's only been around for what? 3 decades or so in a more or less publicly accessible way. And if you look at the African continent, really the internet boom is much more recent in terms of access outside of universities and globalized businesses. But there are also, some of your presentations brought out the importance of other written sources. We shouldn't forget what's in the libraries, what's in the archives, and how getting access to the records of clubs, of leagues, of football associations is not always easy. Hikabwa Chipande has done remarkable work trying to dig up the records of these copper belt clubs going back to the colonial period, and many of you have done similar work in your countries and regions. The press is so important, but also what individuals have in their own homes, those scrapbooks. Sometimes they have the records of the clubs or pieces of them. So it's important to also look outside or offline, let's say. And what James has been talking about is often overlooked too, that material sources should be considered, the actual trophies, the jerseys that are still hanging in closets, the footballs of olden days, even the shoes, the photographs, other illustrations. And then, it's amazing what you can find on YouTube, but there are institutions that have newsreels, that have shreds of film, of video. I remember being amazed at seeing that FLN 11 team playing on the pitch in the documentary film Football Rebels. And I'm not sure where they got the footage, but to actually see those guys playing that phenomenally entertaining and successful football really changed my perspective in amazing ways. And also, all of you really did a remarkable job of highlighting how, if you're going to do African football history, you have to use oral sources. If you just stick to the documents, you're going to get a very narrow and very partial view. So oral history is something that Africanist historians have been doing for a long time, and it is a signature method. And this is how we get the African voices. This is how we get people's memories, the former players, the coaches, the administrators, the referees, the fans, the announcers, people who are not well represented, if at all, in the written documents. And, here I think the knowledge, the linguistics and knowledge of African languages is crucial. What, you bring as Africans doing this research, and what sometimes outsiders like me can bring by learning languages and having research experience, is to understand really the internal discourse of the game, the nicknames, the praise singing, why play by play is done in a particular way, right? Those are all very important. And, as we go forward, local scholars are absolutely crucial to producing this new knowledge and showing the way in which African men and African women and even youth shaped their involvement in the game. So you cannot talk about migration. You cannot talk about playing styles, the many playing styles, the changing tactics. You cannot talk about the fan cultures or even the role of media if you're not deeply steeped in this culture. And so I think that's worth highlighting. So my thought concluding here, and then I'll leave it up to you all to say a final word, is that we need a lot more work on a number of topics, especially the women's game, the game in the schools. There's a rich history there that unfortunately is dying because of structural adjustment and other factors. The game in the rural areas, very popular, but very rarely covered, in the histories, amateur and professional histories. Community football, like, for example, in religious institutions and other type of non-governmental, local level football. And then I would always like to see people who look at the game, not just for what happens on the pitch, but for its social implications. What does it mean for politics? What does it mean for culture? What does it mean for business? What does it mean for all these other things? And here, our work, as I think James and others have pointed out, is absolutely reliant on librarians, on institutional libraries and repositories, on others to give us, share with us documents and provide access. Because if we don't get this access and we're unable to preserve it and make it accessible to future researchers, how are we going to write this exciting history of today in 15 to 20 years? Comments, reflections. Open up the field to anyone who wants to chime in.
Can I say something here, Peter?
Please, Chuka.
One of the amazing things you said, which is very important, is the importance of newspaper archives. I say this because only recently I had gone in to take a look at the women game in Nigeria, which was important. And that's been, I think it's been published by the International Journal of the History of Sport. And I was stunned to learn that the women game in Nigeria actually started, at least in terms of newspaper, it might have even started earlier, as far back as 1937, which was shocking information to me. And that in fact, the first league for the women in Nigeria was talked about in 1972. And they set up a league, and because they weren't accepted with the men league at that time, they set up a league in Midwest Nigeria. So these are some of the things that the newspaper archives that you mentioned, that they are so valuable in discovering some of these things, that kind of information. There is a trove of information there. So thank you for pointing that out.
Absolutely. 1937, evidence of football being played by women in Nigeria. That is a great example, again, of what happens when you do this original research. You start to break down, stereotypes and misunderstandings about, for example, the women's game being something that is a contemporary development. Yes, of course, the boom of the women's game is more recent. But again, that was more than 70 years ago.
And I had read an obituary of a a British woman who was in Nigeria, and I've since lost the reference to that, which I'm kicking myself. But she was in the 20s teaching women's football in Nigeria. So, you know, whether that was at the school or whatever, I know that information is out there somewhere, and at some point it'll turn up again. But that is the kind of thing that we need to capture, and obviously oral histories if we can get them. But a lot of those people will have passed. I mean, in terms of Kenya, I know that there were leagues in the 70s too, but it's not documented very well. And I would love to do the research myself, but I'm not going to be able to do all that research myself. So I'm hoping that sending these seeds out there and that so many people will pick it up and want to do it. Like James has been doing with his family, that people can do it with their family. I say that Matt Kerwin has a question about the factors that make a country more likely to have a women's squad ranked. And he asked about democratic regimes, better female representation. And, you know, I don't know for sure. I mean, when you look at the top, the teams that have been in there 19 times and are ranked fairly high, I mean, I guess 3 of them are democratic. You know, I mean, Cameroon, do we count that as democratic or not? Depends. And Morocco, you know, it's a little bit, but Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, yeah, you know, so at least since, 2003, but there's more work to be done there. And this is something that I was just playing with the statistics. And if somebody is really good with data science and all these factors, we'll get somebody in to help do some regressions and figure it out. I think money is a huge thing. Population's a huge thing. Although Egypt also has a huge population. They were going strong for a long time, and then they fell off. They're barely coming back now in terms of women's football. So, yeah.
I would also just say, picking up on what Martha said, I've noticed that recently diaspora is actually a big plus. Just noticing that with the Algerian women's national team, the fact that they can go and recruit French-born or French-raised Algerian players and bring them to the Algerian women's national team is actually really providing a boost, much like it did with the men's national team 10 years ago. But I think that's going to become more and more of a factor as well.
Yeah, and I think on the Egyptian team, some of them have been playing in the U.S. So
I just wanted to address a question that came in about the U.S. Federation and how they're helping to facilitate and integrate soccer history into modern society and broadcast, keeping that history alive. Thanks, Josh. In fact, I talked about the first Hall of Fame, which was in Oneonta, New York, the middle of New York State. It was a great place, great passion. They did get initial funding and help from U.S. Soccer, which was great. But then after a while, it was kind of like that gradually sinking ship that had to keep on, throwing the water out by the side so that they wouldn't sink completely. But they finally did in 2010. And then all of their artifacts and souvenirs and cultural heritage were shipped down to North Carolina, down to a storage facility that's well kept, great air conditioning, very proper, until this Hall of Fame in Dallas was created, with the help of the Lamar Hunt family. The U.S. Open Cup being named after Lamar Hunt, and so now SASH, which is the Society for American Soccer History, our group, we're looking to be to work in between with the Hall of Fame and U.S. Soccer. And one of our current projects on the table is to get a grant in order to help them digitize all of their items that they have down in North Carolina, because they only use 400 in the actual Hall of Fame in Dallas. So we want to be that conduit to work with U.S. Soccer and see how we can get a grant and really build things and make that puzzle be as complete as possible for 2026.
Yeah, and just a quick question that was sent my way about how big of a factor is politics, however you define politics in Algerian football today. And that's a loaded question. We could probably spend another hour and a half talking about that. But I'll just say over the last 20, 30 years, um, the stadium, especially the stadium as a physical place, has been a place for freedom of expression for football supporters. And here we're mostly talking about men, to put that fully in context. In Algeria, fortunately, we still don't have a lot of women going to the stadium. We're talking about young men. We're not even talking about old men. It's still, we're talking demographics 18 to 35 years old. And they traditionally, Algeria has seen a lot of autocratic regimes. And yeah, the one place where supporters can kind of voice any kind of political opinion is actually in the stadium, because you can't crack down 30,000, 40,000 people, all at once. And the regime has also sort of used football as a currency for social peace, in a sense. I could think of the 2011 Arab Spring protests. As soon as there was some hint of trouble after a football match, they usually started after football matches. There would be like protests, or there would be sometimes even looting. That's when we started seeing some subsidies being released by the Algerian government on basic staples like oil and sugar. And you could check out Dr. Mahfoud Amara's article about football and youth subculture, I think. And he speaks a little bit more about that. And finally, in 2019, we had some huge anti-government protests in Algeria. And what was, I think, for me, fascinating about that was that here we had people of all walks of life, men, young women, old men, old women, all singing football songs, because the songs became such a place of freedom of expression that politics started to sort of permeate into the stadium. And they started making political songs, kind of. They were football songs, but they were also political. And people were then using that on the streets when they were protesting against the government. So that was something that what I thought it was very fascinating. I'm writing a paper about it. It should be published in 2022. And so maybe keep an eye out on that. So very, very political, especially when it comes to contesting the government and finding avenues to do that. When it's not on the internet, it's usually in the stadium.
Excellent. So the game continues to be political, but in different ways. And again, the historian is always careful about pointing out why things are happening and why they're happening at that particular time. So a wonderful way, I think, to bring this conversation to a close. I want to thank all of the roundtable participants again for their insights. And I think somebody online commented with a question that said, is this the founding of the Society of the African Football History? I think it was Gerard Akindas, the Supreme Chief of SportsAfrica.org. Yes, maybe. So if you're interested in working on these topics, get in touch with us or with our very dear friend, Brian Wisala, to whom I will now pass the ball to bring things to a close. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, distinguished panelists. I think that was an amazing way to close season 4 of the Africa Football Business Show, where we have been looking at how to strengthen Africa's football ecosystem. And I must say, history is an important, integral part of whatever it is that we want to build. What future do we want to see for football, for sports in Africa? History really has to play a part. And I will quote or paraphrase what James Brown from the Society of American Soccer History said towards the end of his presentation. We need history in order to move better into the future. And we have seen that today from our distinguished panelists. Really key lessons we can learn from the future. When I had Hikabwa describe the situation in Zambia, and I can see reflections of that in Kenya as we speak today, then we know there is a lot we can learn from the past that we can use to forge ahead. So mine is just to thank you all once again. We'll just use my screen to mention your names. Peter Alegi for the wonderful moderation. Chuka Onwumechili from Nigeria, thank you very much. James Brown, thank you for your presentation. I look forward to engaging with you more. Hikabwa Chipande, all the way from Yaounde, but from Zambia originally. Thank you also for being with us today, and must say for representing the Africa Union Sports Council. I think that is very important. Maher Mezahi, it's been a pleasure to listen to you. I must say the FLN story is one of those that inspires me. I wonder if we are going to have an FLN in the present day football, where we have a crop of players coming back to help build football on the continent. Last but not least, our lady Martha Saavedra, thank you for representing women's football. We really appreciate your presentation. And yeah, at the Football Foundation for Africa, we are always looking forward to engage with different partners. And one of our friends really have been the Sports Africa fraternity. It's really a gold mine, if I can say that, in terms of knowledge that we need to transform our industry. So for us here, the Africa Football Business Show is to thank as well our viewers. Thank you for your contributions throughout this season since August, and we look forward to starting another series in February after the Africa Cup of Nations, which will be held in Cameroon. And actually, our theme for the next season will be transforming our game, looking at how we can take African football to the next level. And I look forward to hosting some of you on this show in future. Last but not least, the people who make it possible, that's our partners, OTB Africa, Parma Sports, CBeyond Leadership Forum, iSport LAN, not forget the Football Business Academy that supported us earlier. We appreciate the resources that you afford to us. Without you, this would be a little bit more challenging, and it's important that we recognize you. So see everybody in February. In the meantime, feel free to follow us on our various socials. Those are available at the Football Foundation for Africa, especially on Twitter now. And yes, let's continue having this conversation and see how we can move the game forward. Thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
You take care.